With your fake bars, cause you probably think Rolls Royce only make cars. This is
I'm George Galloway. Apologies for the late start and welcome to this, the fourth international global public meeting under the rubric No to NATO, No to War. 500,000 people watched the last of our meetings. Let's see if by spreading it and sharing it everywhere, we can do even better than that, because we definitely have to if we are going to bring about an end to hostilities which threaten the peace of all of Europe, have already wrecked the prosperity of much of Europe, and of course have left us under the shadow of the prospect of thermonuclear intercontinental war. It doesn't get more serious than the situation we find ourselves in today. No to NATO, No to War is a broadly based organization which does what it says on the tin and nothing more and nothing less. I speak as one of its founders and the man who moved the foundation resolution. It was an idea of the Workers' Party of Britain, which I have the honor to lead, and Chris Williamson and his then organization Resist, which is now a part of the Workers' Party of Britain. But you don't need to support any or all of the policies of the Workers' Party of Britain to not want nuclear war and to have concluded that the ever ambitious, ever expanding, super expensive NATO organization is the biggest threat to international order and to world peace. Everyone with half a brain can see what use America has made of Ukraine. And Zelensky found yesterday in Europe, in Vilnius, exactly what happens to the puppets, the satraps that the US employs, and the UK for that matter, when their usefulness has begun to dissipate. Everyone could see the pictures, the body language, and even the actual language of Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who had been badly let down by those that had encouraged, armed, financed, propagandized for this ruinous war, which has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, cost the treasure of hundreds of billions of dollars. From the outside, no one has begun to calculate yet the economic losses, the losses in infrastructure that have been inflicted upon Ukraine itself in a war that never needed to be fought, in a war that could have been avoided if the promises made first to Gorbachev back in the 1990s and even in the Minsk Accords, Minsk I and Minsk II, which if implemented would have obviated the need for the special military operation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we wouldn't be having this meeting now. And hundreds of thousands of dead people would still be alive, and many things that have been destroyed would still be extant. The War Spreads to Europe is the title of tonight's event. And of course, the gang that gathered in Vilnius had come to Europe for the purposes. Joe Biden had dragged himself out of his bath chair, away from his precious auto cues, which he can't even now read properly, cogently, and traveled to Britain, where he unforgettably inspected the guards at Windsor Castle in a way that will live long in the memory. But Joe Biden had to be there because he is the one calling the shots. And the American people are making a huge financial contribution to the Ukrainian war effort and to the extraordinary fact that the US taxpayer is now paying for social security benefits in Ukraine, benefits which it does not even pay to its own people. The signs are that in the United States, people are beginning to wake up to the extraordinary reality of hundreds of billions of dollars being given to a faraway country in Eastern Europe, of which they know little, could not place on a map, and if you really forced them to, would have to admit they don't care which side of a line, Kupiansk, or any long list of unpronounceable, unspellable foreign names, which is what this conflict is currently being fought about. But the European public has already paid. The German public has already paid. The French public has already paid. The difference between Germany and France is that so far only France has taken to the streets in huge numbers and met with brutal repression, the kind of repression France and other European countries like to condemn when it occurs in other parts of the world. Ferocious oppression was required, and internet censorship and total media censorship. For all we know, there might now, right now, be riots going on in France. How could we know if social media has been hijacked and if the so-called mainstream media had not been suborned? But it will not stay quiet for long in France. And I predict it will not stay quiet for long in Germany or in Britain, for that matter, because our economies have been tanked in the name of turning Russia into rubble. An operation that can best be described in the word blowback, in the word the word boomerang. The boomerang was obvious. We threw it at the Russians and it came back and hit us squarely in the face. Our people, increasingly unemployed, having to be offered wage increases vastly less than the prevailing rate of inflation, meaning a cut in real terms in the standard of life of millions, tens of millions of working class people in Britain and throughout the European Union. And yesterday in Vilnius, the checkbooks were out again. Another 1.5 billion was handed over. Rishi Sunak is ready to pay whatever it takes, he says, and for as long as necessary for Ukraine, while his own country heads for the knacker's yard. There must come a point at which the public say, thus far, no further. We don't want bloody war, your bloody, profligate, expensive war any longer. And it's our job in No to NATO, No to War to increase the number of members of the public who are demanding that of their politicians. As Dr. Johnson, the great Englishman of letters, said, the knowledge that one is to be hanged in the morning concentrates the mind wonderfully. We have to have these European governments and North American governments contemplating the fact that metaphorically they will be hanged in the morning if they continue to drag us down this terrifyingly dangerous path. The truth is, the war had a turning point yesterday when NATO declared that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO until the end of the war. They guaranteed two things. One was that the Ukrainians know that they are on the battlefield on their own. Sure, they have almost unlimited war material, but it's burning on the Ukrainian steppes. A huge proportion of the super expensive weaponry supplied by NATO countries to Ukraine has already been destroyed, and that which has not been destroyed has singularly failed to make the slightest dent in the Russian lines in this so-called spring, then summer counter-offensive. Indeed, quite the opposite has happened. Overnight, huge advances of many kilometers of the Russian armed forces, particularly around the aforementioned Kupiansk, have taken place. A large number of Ukrainians, knowing what happened in Vilnius, have surrendered today. Others are choosing not to fight as bravely and resourcefully as they have been fighting hitherto. So that's the first outcome of the Vilnius refusal to allow Ukraine to join NATO. The morale in the Ukrainian armed forces has fallen, and the morale in the Russian armed forces has commensurately risen. But the second outcome is of more significance even than that. It was, said Austin, said Biden, and said, though less stridently, many others, certain that Ukraine will join NATO when the war ends. This, of course, guarantees that the war will never end on terms that would see Ukraine joining NATO. Otherwise, the entire Russian military operation would have been for nothing. If at the end of the conflict, Ukraine still has a government that will apply and will be accepted into NATO, turning whatever part of Western Ukraine remains under the governance of Kiev, becoming a NATO armed camp with NATO nuclear weapons. Just minutes, and a small number of minutes from Moscow and from the great conurbations of the Russian Federation. Think about it. How could Russia stop advancing if it knows that whatever it does not take will then automatically join NATO? And that's why the Russians have said today that the outcome in Vilnius almost guarantees conflict, potentially nuclear conflict, between Russia and NATO. So it was a bad day yesterday for Ukraine, but it was a bad day for the rest of us, because it means that the war will have to continue until enough, maybe all, of the territory of Ukraine is guaranteed never to be a member of NATO. Now, we have assembled, as always, a panel of accomplished and experienced people from different fields and different, very different political points of view, making the point I made earlier, that this is a broadly based organization. Some are diplomats, some are journalists, some are academics of the very first rank. Some are more than one of these things at the same time. The first is a founder member of No2Nato, No to War, a former British ambassador, no less. He is His Excellency, the Honourable Peter Ford, who joins us as the first speaker at tonight's meeting. Excellency, welcome to the panel. Would you like to make some opening remarks? By all means, critique anything I have said, or say what you would like to say. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you very much, George, for having me on this panel. I hope I can do justice to your faith in me. I would like to pick up on the last point that you were making about the way the outcome of Vilnius has more or less guaranteed that the conflict will continue indefinitely, because if Russia was stupid enough to come to some peace agreement, the outcome would be that Ukraine would then become a member of NATO. And the Russians are obviously not going to be that stupid. But actually, I think this is not a bad outcome. Paradoxically, I was more afraid of an outbreak of peace, a botched peace like the Minsk Accords of 2014. You will recall how a previous round of fighting came to a conclusion with the Minsk Accords, which turned out to be a poisoned chalice that was given to Russia, promises that were never meant to be kept, as admitted by Angela Merkel, the previous German Chancellor. The Minsk Accords were designed by the Western countries as a stopgap to give Ukraine more time to build up its armed forces ready for future rounds of fighting. We don't want that to happen again. No Minsk II. And it's hard, in fact, to imagine how, regardless of what happened yesterday, the Russians could be so naive as ever to attach any credibility given to Western promises in a peace agreement. And in the background, let's remember another historical precedent, the botched Versailles Agreement after the First World War, which carried the seed of an even greater conflagration, leaving an irredentist state, Germany, determined to claw back on the battlefield what it had lost on the negotiating table. And what we definitely do not want is for Ukraine to end up in that position, having signed a kind of phony peace deal, but irredentist because it wants to claw back what it sees as lost territories, and determined to do that by force of arms, possibly backed even more by NATO. So I think actually Vilnius was not that bad, paradoxically. It was bad enough, but it could have been worse. That we have avoided, for the moment anyway, the risk from Minsk II, a botched peace agreement. What we're heading for, I think, is something more along the lines of the Korean armistice. The two sides back in the early 50s fought themselves more or less to a standstill, a stalemate, and that this fragile peace has held very successfully, as it happens, for 70 years. Let us hope that something similar might be the outcome in Ukraine.
But what would be, in such a frozen conflict scenario, what would then happen, presumably, is that Kiev would apply to join NATO and NATO would accept it, at least based on the statements yesterday.
Legally, diplomatically, there's a big difference between a ceasefire and a final peace agreement. In military terms, also, a ceasefire is something temporary. The state of belligerency would continue, as it does in Korea. You can have an armistice is simply a rather grand term for a ceasefire. But that's what it means. And I'm sure that Russia will be skillful enough. Their diplomats are the best in the world, in my experience, to avoid Western traps. And let's not forget that the United States really does not want Ukraine to become a member, because it would risk being dragged in to the conflict. The US Congress, when it was agreeing to the NATO treaty in 1949, was very careful to ensure that the wording of the famous Article 5, which lazy journalists believe commits NATO states to go to each other's rescue if there's a war, doesn't actually say that. It says, and of course it was written by lawyers and will be read always by lawyers, that it commits the states to take action, undefined action. It could just be supply of weapons, it could be intelligence support. It definitely does not commit legally the deployment of full military might. Of course, there would be some more political pressure to go to war if under this scenario, but the Americans, I'm quite sure, do not want that anyway. The Americans, God forgive me for saying it, but they are the adults in the room here, and we're in a pretty awful state of affairs where we have to rely on the Americans to exercise some adult supervision. But the Europeans, if left to their own devices yesterday, might very well have admitted Ukraine tomorrow. But the Americans and rationally.
Well, Peter, I'll stop you there and we'll bring you back in later as your signal is beginning to fade. Thank you for excellent erudite contribution thus far, and there'll be more from Ambassador Peter Ford later. Let me turn to a journalist from Unity Network News, David Clews, a fellow countryman of mine and a fellow campaigner, at least on one thing. There may be one other, but at least on one thing, which is that this war is leading us to ruin and has to be stopped. David Clews, thank you very much for joining us. This is, I think, your second appearance on our platforms. The floor is yours. Say your piece, and I may intervene with a question or two.
How's that audio? Is that okay? Yeah, you can hear me fine?
Very good, very clear.
Perfect. Well, can I just say again what an honour it is to be back here again with you, George, and also the great Peter Ford as well. And you know, just thinking a bit more about what everyone's been talking about, I really sense the fatigue has now come in on this conflict. You can see it. You can see it with NATO. You can see it with Zelensky. You can even see it with the Russians as well. And we're at this point now. We're 500 plus days into this, and really, is this stalemate? And you know, you mentioned that earlier. The ruble will turn to rubble. You know, and a lot of what I think the neocons thought in Washington was, I think they thought the sanctions package would destroy Russia. I think they thought when they kicked them out of SWIFT, they froze their current foreign currency reserves. I think they thought that Russia would collapse and Putin would be removed. And then you had that whole nonsense 2 or 3 weeks ago with Prigozhin and Wagner, which I'm still trying to get my head around. But you could see the way they thought, well, this is it. This is what we'd hope would happen. But Zelensky looks defeated. He really does yesterday. And you know, regardless of it all, and as you pointed out, hundreds of thousands dead. For what? For absolutely nothing. And you know, we see the footage coming out of Kiev. You see it coming out of Lvov as well. People are still out partying. They're enjoying themselves. There's a lot more Range Rovers, BMWs, Audis being bought. And it's young men from rural areas, poor people who think that they're fighting for Ukraine. They think they're fighting for their fatherland. They think they're fighting for something. And it's horrible, the lies that they've been told. And it's not just the deaths, it's the maimings as well. Much more footage coming out, people losing legs, losing arms, horrific stuff. And they're fighting for BlackRock and Vanguard to take over their country. They're fighting for Zelensky to have his place in the international stage. It's vile. And, you know, with NATO yesterday, and you know, the hatred I now have for NATO, that is a mafia. Do you know what's worse than a mafia organisation? It's worse. They were there yesterday and all smiles and celebrating. And I think, as Peter pointed out, it would be interesting to see how ironclad Article 5 actually was. Whether if push really came to the shove, they would come to each other's rescue and they would fight. But my experience usually is when people reach these high points of hubris, that's the high water mark, and it is downhill from here. So I hope we can get a quick end to this conflict. You see a lot of tension now. That the Ben Wallace statement, I think, was quite telling. Now, I don't know whether he said that about it's not an Amazon list, whether that's to try and appease the electorate, who obviously is getting a bit angry, a bit of pushback, or whether it's actually real, whether they're actually looking, saying, this guy's completely ungrateful. We've tanked our economies. We've sent them all, and they're still demanding more. So we'll need to see. But I think everything you said, everything Peter Ford said about how this will all look in the end is true. It's what's going to happen over the next 100 to 200 days. This counter-offensive has been an absolute disaster. You've got NATO equipment destroyed. They've achieved absolutely nothing except death, and it's just a dreadful situation. And again, it's utterly shameful that this conversation that I'm having with you and Peter and George is only being held here on social media. It's not a debate that's been had within the mainstream media. Total suppression, because at least during the Iraq War, there was discussion of what was going on. There was a debate. Obviously, they didn't listen at the time, but there was, whereas now, nothing, completely shut down. And it is abysmal, because I think they know the truth, that if people really got a sniff of what was going on in Ukraine, the real reason why this conflict is taking place, what is really was going on, public support for it would just collapse. So that's what I've got to say tonight, George.
It's a very powerful contribution. I just want to press you on the Ben Wallace thing. The perception that Ukraine is a simply insatiable devourer of our money, America's money, our money, Europe's money, must now have grown amongst public, or Wallace would not have made that statement. I'm sure that you are right in your analysis that he was trying to appease the electorate. This is a man who takes your money, doesn't even thank you for your money, and as soon as he's taken it, is demanding more money. And this was, I think, a telling statement from the British Defense Secretary Wallace, as was Zelensky's sarcastic reply. I'll remember to phone Ben Wallace every morning and say thank you. This indicates tension between bosom buddies, and that must be because they can read the runes inside public opinion, don't you think?
Well, again, with Zelensky, anyone that is lionized like that is made out to be this superhero, when it couldn't be further from the truth. That the pillars of sand are going to collapse very, very, very quickly. And I mean, I can't think of people in history who have actually despised as much as Zelensky, because he is so out of his depth, and he has been played like an absolute fiddle. Now, say what you like about Gaddafi, Saddam, the way the West courted these people. These guys were serious statesmen. They weren't fools. Whereas this guy, I think he will go down really as one of the tragic figures in history. And in years to come, people who are Ukrainian or whatever exists left of Ukraine will spit whenever the name Zelensky is heard.
Well, I urge everyone to watch Scott Ritter's new film. It's in 2 parts called Agent Zelensky. And it's an eye-opener, even for those of us who thought we knew everything there was to know about Mr. Vladimir or Vladimir.
Vladimir Zelensky. I mean, he was brought up speaking. He brought up speaking Russian. He pretends he doesn't. It's
better than he does.
Vladimir. Now he's Volodymyr. It's crazy stuff.
David, thank you for that.
Thanks,
Let me bring in the third speaker, George Szamuely, who is my favorite academic. I don't have many favorite academics, but he is definitely number 1. He's a frequent guest on my television show, the mother of all talk shows, and always acquits himself so powerfully. He's based in Budapest in Hungary, the only country in NATO, the only, well, maybe Turkey would be a slight exception, but only yesterday, not today, and maybe not tomorrow. But Hungary is the only consistent EU and NATO country to be trying to bring this war to an end. And so it's a pleasure, George, to welcome you from Budapest.
Thank you, George.
The floor is yours.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, what NATO has always been good at is propaganda. It's brilliant at public relations. So it's managed to fool the world for now almost 3/4 of a century that it is a defensive organization. But let's recall history. NATO was founded in 1949, a full 6 years before the Warsaw Pact. So NATO justifies itself, well, we have to defend Europe against the Warsaw Pact. Well, the Warsaw Pact didn't come into existence till 1955. And who were the signatories of the original North Atlantic Treaty? Well, we have Iceland and Italy and Portugal. How were Iceland, Italy, and Portugal under any kind of threat at all against the Soviet Union? So back in 1949, most of the world was quite anxious. And, less than 4 years had elapsed since the end of World War II. So the rest of the world was a little worried about the creation of a military alliance. Where is this going to lead? So that's why right in the first article, Article 1, NATO made this declaration that NATO member states commit themselves to resolving all disputes they may be involved in with non-NATO member states in exclusively peaceful means. Now, of course, NATO has never done that. And it's essentially created the very conditions that he was supposed to be fighting against. Because, of course, how did the Soviet Union respond to the creation of NATO? Well, it consolidated itself in Eastern Europe. And then when NATO inducted and rearmed West Germany into NATO, the Soviet Union responded by creating its own rival organization, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO. It wasn't the other way around. And that Article 1, which is, there it is, the pride of place, far more important than Article 5. Everyone only talks about Article 5. Article 1 is most important. That Article 1 has been violated by NATO repeatedly. It went to war against Yugoslavia. How did it solve its dispute with Yugoslavia by peaceful means? It didn't even have a dispute with Yugoslavia. There was no dispute between NATO and Yugoslavia. NATO picked a fight against a state that wasn't doing it any harm at all. The same thing applies in Libya. There was no dispute between NATO and Libya. And so NATO committed itself to expansion, unrestricted expansion. And what's the basis for it? Well, Bill Clinton, the man who masterminded this expansion during the 1990s, he gave an explanation of his last year. He said, well, back in the early 90s, we were worried about the revival of an ultra-nationalist, imperialist Russia. So we thought that, well, if we are going to have this ultra-nationalist, imperialist Russia, we need to strengthen NATO. So we need to bring in a whole bunch of new states into NATO. Well, of course, yet again, what was the effect of that? The effect of that was to create the very conditions that then NATO was struggling against, because, of course, Russia could not but respond with deepening concern as NATO continued scooping up country after country after country. And it reached the point of Ukraine. And then, we saw in 2008, when NATO made that commitment to Ukraine and Georgia, Putin made a speech there. He warned that this is a very serious step that you have undertaken. This is going to end in trouble. NATO had every indication of what happened in Georgia in 2008, and yet it continued. Year after year, it continued to promise Ukraine that you will be a member of NATO. It's going to happen. Don't worry about anything. And in 2014, when the NATO powers, chiefly the United States, engineered a coup in Ukraine, the first thing they did, the first thing the coup leaders did, was to change the Ukrainian constitution and declare that their fundamental aspiration is to join NATO. That guaranteed war. So NATO absolutely guaranteed that war in 2014. And as Secretary General Stoltenberg has repeatedly said, well, we have been in Ukraine since 2014. We've been building up the Ukrainian forces. We've been providing them with arms, we have intelligence, everything. For what? For what reason? Other than preparing for war. And that's what NATO is doing. Now, I'm going back to Vilnius. I am, not as sanguine as Peter was, because I think that this war is exactly what NATO wants. There was never any chance that they were actually going to bring Ukraine into NATO, because for the United States, and basically NATO is an extension of the United States. For the United States, they want a proxy war. They don't want a proper war. Of course, they weren't going to let Ukraine into NATO. If you get Ukraine into NATO, then suddenly it becomes a direct war between the United States and Russia. The United States doesn't want to do that. The United States has always been very crafty. It's waged its wars by proxy means. And that's what they've been doing. I mean, that's why they've been doing it in Ukraine. Essentially, the goal is, let's bleed Russia dry. Let's, get them to, lose as many men as possible. Let them, lose their treasure. Let it go on for years and years. And this will essentially just destroy Russia. And, with the hope that maybe there'll be a change of government, maybe Russia will disintegrate. But that's the U.S. objective. And it was never about Ukraine. So the whole drama, will Ukraine get in? Won't Ukraine get in? It was never on. That was never the goal. As if somehow Ukraine's entry into NATO was ever an issue. The only thing that was an issue was to keep this proxy war going and keep draining and destroying Russia with a slow process. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be successful. And it's in a war of attrition. I still think that probably Russia has the means to win a war of attrition, but that's the objective. It's a very dark, it's a very sinister plan, but unfortunately, that's what NATO has committed itself to. And so Zelensky, and I have some sympathy for him. He's a disastrous, catastrophic leader for Ukraine, but he's saying, hey, this is your principle. This is the principle that you're fighting for, that NATO has an open door policy. Nobody has a veto on who gets into NATO. And then you turn around and say, well, actually, you can't get into NATO. But once the war is over, then you can join NATO. And then he turns around and says, yeah, but when the war is over, we will already have been defeated. What's the use of being a member of NATO after we've already been defeated? Well, of course, NATO doesn't have an answer to that question, because NATO really doesn't care very much. It just wants to continue with this awful proxy war.
Ambassador Ford posited one potential ending, if you like, the frozen conflict, the Korean Peninsula, an armistice, but no peace. So a state of no war, no peace between North and South Korea as being a possible outcome in this. I posit a different one to you, which is, given my view that Russia cannot possibly allow the current regime in Kiev, with its pattern of relations in the world, to continue to exist when they stop fighting. And therefore, the future I see for any Western Ukrainian entity, however big, however small, it may turn out to be very small indeed and landlocked. I see Western Ukraine as the new East Germany, a buffer between Russia and those self-declared or certainly obvious enemies of Russia on the other side of the Ukrainian border. Which of these two, or by all means, posit a third way, do you see this ending in?
Well, I'm much closer to your position than Peter's, because I don't think there'll be any kind of an armistice. I don't think there's going to be any kind of negotiations. I just don't see any basis for sitting around the table and thrashing anything out. It's obvious that Russia cannot just simply stop fighting. So it has to keep moving forward and ensure that whatever is left of Ukraine cannot ever pose a threat to Russia. So I think it will be landlocked. I think that their objective has to be to take Odessa. The plan, I think, for regime change, I think that's off the table. That they were hoping for that right at the beginning. That didn't happen. So there's just going to be very little left now. And then essentially Russia will turn around and say, okay, this is all you've got. Take it. If you want it, you can join NATO, but essentially it's useless to you. It has no outlets to the sea. It's just a piece of territory. No doubt, you're going to try and build it up as as somehow yet another armed fortress against Russia, but that's not going to happen for a long time. This rump state that will be handed over to NATO won't be in any position to fight any kind of a war for at least a generation. So I think that's probably where it's going to go. I don't think there's going to be any kind of a negotiated outcome. I think Russia is just going to have to take that much more. They can't allow any kind of a serious military threat to them. And I think if they allow Ukraine to have any access to the Black Sea, that will be a major threat to Russia.
Thank you, Professor. Let me go back to Peter Ford, Ambassador Ford, to, of course, give him the chance to respond to that. But also, Peter, if you will, deal with this point. I was struck by one of your phrases, that the Americans are the adults in the room. They were also in the Libyan conflict. It was Cameron and Sarkozy that were dragging the American government deeper and deeper into what Obama now says was his biggest mistake. And maybe in Washington, they don't want a repeat of that. How did it come to pass that the Foreign Office in which you served once, after a fashion, a temple of sagacity, of experience, of centuries of colonial rule and practice, and so on? In other words, how did our government get so stupid?
Well, I think you answered your own question, George, by using the word colonial. Our thought habits remain stuck in the days of the empire. Britannia rules the waves, and waves the rules when it suits also. But the Americans are a lot more practical. They're a lot more transactional, to use the word that's often used with regard to Donald Trump. What's in it for us? America first. But the British, with our traditions of the charge of the Light Brigade in Ukrainian Crimea, are well, dolts, fools. We charge after pointless targets, and sometimes we get our way, as we did with removing Gaddafi. And let's be honest, it didn't cost us very much. But we failed when we tried to overthrow Assad. But again, we got away with it. It didn't cost us very much. And I suppose today we're quite happy to see Zelensky leading his charge towards the Crimea, and thousands of his soldiers are falling. We are paying something of a financial price, but our government seems to think that it's on to a bit of a winner with the public. Which brings me to Zelensky and George Wallace. I think Vilnius showed Zelensky in a new light. I think David was making this point. He looked a bit pathetic. For the first time, he looked like a bit of a clown, or really quite a bit of a clown. How come he gets away without wearing a suit and tie? His soldier persona is beginning to grate, and he looks like the comedy actor that he really is. He looked about as welcome in Vilnius as if he'd been Hugh Edwards showing up, the disgraced BBC presenter. Many of them were cold shouldering him. And George Wallace's cruel expression, I think, will be stuck to Zelensky from now on. He's going to be the Amazon shopper. The Amazon shopper. I think that's a good nickname for him. The guy who thinks that the NATO countries are just a big warehouse that he can plunder at his will. But there again, I noticed the Americans are more cautious than the Europeans. While the Germans allowed their much touted Leopard 2 tanks to enter the fray and be tested and found wanting, because many of them have been destroyed by IEDs, improvised explosive devices in the minefields. The Americans have been smart enough to keep the F-16s always just over the horizon. And I would take a wager that this time next year they'll still be just over the horizon. For more than one reason, but one is that the F-16s have never been tested in contested battle. They've participated in conflicts like Syria and Libya, but those were turkey shoots. They weren't going to be shot down from the ground by something like the air defenses that the Russians have. And I think the manufacturers, if not the government, the administration, don't want to see their bestseller actually put to the test.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you, Peter, for your contributions. David Clews, on that very point, if you like, Peter's last point, the Ben Wallace incident definitely illustrates, doesn't it, the extent to which patience is wearing thin with Zelensky. Peter made the sartorial point, a very good one. His wife is wearing a $10,000 Louis Vuitton, but he's still wearing that T-shirt he's been wearing for the last 500 days. The scowl on his face when he was turned down was unbecoming, undiplomatic for sure. What do you think the parliamentarians, the British parliamentarians, the members of the Conservative government, really think about Mr. Zelensky?
And we're all on. I think I think they're still in love with him in this really, really strange way. It was interesting Peter pointed that out. I do actually think within the British, they have kind of fallen for the propaganda. They actually do think that it is a moral and a just conflict. I think that is actually a very, very good point that Peter made. But I think until they start seeing some pushback from the electorate and that things aren't going well, that they might start saying something. But as of now, I've not heard one single elected politician in Westminster, Northern Ireland, or Wales, or Scotland criticise the policy. I've not heard one. So it'll be interesting to see when someone actually does. And it was interesting. We've had quite a lot of talks about the what it might look like. I personally feel what this will look more like is the Vietnam situation, where, now I might get my dates slightly wrong, but I believe the Americans withdrew and their forces, was it 71? They started
73.
73. They started withdrawing their forces fully, and then by 75, the whole place fell. I think you're going to have a more, and along the lines of George as well, that Vietnam-style situation. That the whole thing will just collapse in Ukraine, and the Americans will give some sort of guarantee, and they just won't do it. And I mean, you couldn't mark these people's neck with a blowtorch. They'll just move on to something else, because I think as I said, they're bored of this. I think they want a war with China. I think a war over Taiwan's probably more preferable for them now, and they've realised they've not got the hit they want with this. But again, more and more people dying. But a great conversation. I've really enjoyed this tonight.
I wonder if there'll be room, George Szamuely, for Zelensky on the helicopter taking off from the American embassy in Kiev. A day I remember well, a red letter day. This Article 5 thing that Peter first raised is, I think, worth exploring. I've always believed, call me a cynic, that the United States for sure would not go to World War III over, let me choose one at random, Estonia. I do not believe that the United States would enter what might become an intercontinental thermonuclear war of annihilation over Estonia. And I don't believe that Article 5 in any way requires them to. But Peter's right. Everyone imagines that NATO's Article 5 triggers all-out world war, but it doesn't, does it?
Article 5 says that in the event of an attack on one, that's considered an attack on all, and that each individual member state then decides for itself what it will do or maybe not do to help the state that has been attacked. And George, you're absolutely right. It was always absurd, the whole idea that the United States would be ready. Even, I mean, back in the days when it was just West Germany, that people say, well, you know, they're not going to sacrifice New York and Boston for Hamburg and Dusseldorf. They just weren't going to do it. So even less likely is it that they're going to do it for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. However, the Americans might well be willing to wage a war on the European continent. And I think that has always been, particularly back when there used to be a left, as you know, George, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was always a suspicion that the back in the minds of the Americans, they did think about maybe fighting a war strictly limited on the European continent, and then bring it to an end before it becomes an intercontinental fight. So I think the Americans may well consider some option like that. But there's no way in the world that they would just simply start sacrificing their own lives and their own cities for these tiny little statelets. That's why this war, as it's continuing in Ukraine, isn't so bad for the Americans. And that's why they keep writing out these checks, because Americans aren't dying, Russians are dying, Ukrainians are dying, which means Slavic peoples are dying. America's sitting quite pretty. Their economy isn't doing badly. Why not keep it going? I mean, it's the Anglo-Saxons. They're all they have 3 meals a day. They go to bed in their own beds. So it's the people that they fundamentally don't like, with the Slavic peoples, who are killing one another. It's a tragedy, but for the Americans, it isn't so bad, and that's why they're happy to keep it going. And I think many people keep, like Ben Wallace, they think, oh, the Americans, the right, the right wing isolationists might come to power, and they might suddenly say, enough already. Well, maybe Trump will come to power, and maybe Trump will indeed bring it to an end. Maybe, but we know from his first term that he actually did exactly the opposite. He actually escalated the war in Ukraine by sending lethal weapons that Obama, terrible president though he was, but at least Obama had, put a block on sending lethal weapons. So we don't know what President Trump would do. Maybe he'll end it, or maybe he'll just escalate it. But nonetheless, it's something that Europeans, wring their hands. Oh no, the terrible right, the American right, is coming to power, and they're going to lose interest in us, and they're going to lose interest in NATO. They're going to lose interest in this war in Ukraine. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I don't see any prospect of this happening.
Peter, last word from you, please. I'm intrigued. Everyone who follows this is intrigued. What is Turkey really up to? What is Erdogan really up to? He collapsed over Swedish membership of NATO, or did he? Because he now tells us the Turkish parliament will have to decide that matter, and it will not even begin to do so until October. And is he stabbing Russia in the back, or is Russia and Turkey dancing together, a kind of concealed minuet between the two? What's your take on that?
Well, I think Erdogan is playing both ends against the middle. He's one of these transactional politicians. That's why he got on quite well with Donald Trump. They speak the same language. What's in it for me? They don't believe in very much, except feathering their own nests. And what preoccupies Erdogan above all, I think, is the economic situation of Turkey, which is quite dire. And therefore he will exploit his relationships with Russia, Iran, and the United States, playing them off against each other to get the best economic deals. It's as simple as that. But I'd like to mention another country just very briefly, Poland. Poland is worrying. Poland is emerging with one of the strongest militaries in Europe and one of the most aggressive governments. Duda has threatened to send troops into Ukraine. And Poles are stupid enough, I think, to do that under certain conditions. And let's never forget history. 1939, the Poles recklessly gave the Germans an excuse or a series of pretexts to kick off World War II by the Polish treatment of German minorities. This gave Hitler the excuse he needed to invade a cocky Poland. And Poland, I saw an estimate just today that in 10 years' time, Poland will have a higher GDP per head, that level of prosperity, than Britain. And this is partly because of Polish coal, which they have no intention of abandoning to any green theories. Poland has the most energy reserves in Europe, the most industrious people, but I'm afraid they're rather aggressive towards Russia. And I find it too easy to imagine a scenario where Poland does get militarily involved directly in Ukraine and triggers a US intervention. And let's not forget, it doesn't have to be a nuclear intervention. There are many intermediate steps. The Americans could feel obliged to send foot soldiers or to deploy the F-16s from Germany. Some theorists hold that nuclear deterrence actually makes the world safe for conventional warfare.
Mm-hmm.
I hope we're not going to see that theory put to the test in Ukraine.
Well, the problem is that if one side was beginning to prevail in such a conventional conflict, ineluctably the recourse to battlefield nuclear weapons at the very least would be inevitable, because for Russia this is an existential conflict, and for NATO ditto, were they to actually put boots on the ground. If they put boots on the ground and the Russians gave them a bloody good hiding, what would NATO do then? They would have to reach for bigger, more explosive sticks. Look, we could go on all night, but we'll be back again with another meeting fairly soon. So let me thank everyone who watched, who contributed, and who spoke at the meeting. Ambassador Peter Ford, David Clews, and Professor George Szamuely. But above all, a big thanks to you, the viewer. Spread it, share it, and draw everyone's attention to the vital importance, please, of no to NATO, no to war.